Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Crystal Golden, and I have the honor of serving as the program coordinator of the Candler Foundry, the newest initiative in public theological education at Candler School of Theology. Our main mission is to make theological education accessible for all through various programming and offerings. So alongside Dr. Ryan Bonfilio, who serves as the director of the Candler Foundry, we have created Candler in Conversation to be a space for Candler students, faculty, staff, alumni, as well as friends of Candler to be in conversation about theology, faith, pressing issues, and public life. We're so excited that you joined us, whether you're watching us live on Facebook or listening to the audio version on our podcast. For today's conversation, we've gathered three phenomenal guests that will engage around the question of, what does protesting have to do with our faith? The entire world seems to be responding to the multiple incidents of racial violence against Black men and women that has happened not only in the last few months, but in the last 400 years. From demonstrations happening in all 50 states in the US to acts of solidarity happening across the globe, marches have been planned, signs have been made, and voices have been lifted to decry the dehumanization of Black bodies. Joining us today, we have Dr. Leah Gunning Francis, Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of Faculty at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana. Dr. Gunning Francis is also the author of the book, Ferguson and Faith, Sparking Leadership in Awakening Community. She interviewed more than 24 clergy and young activists who are actively involved for the movement for racial justice in Ferguson and beyond. Dr. Gunning Francis researched and wrote Ferguson and Faith while serving as the Associate Dean for Contextual Education and Assistant Professor of Christian Education at Eden Theological Seminary. Dr. Gunning Francis received her Master of Divinity degree from Candler and her PhD from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Welcome, Dr. Gunning Francis.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next, we have Dr. Kyle Lambelet, Assistant Professor in the Practice of Theology and Ethics at Candler School of Theology. He teaches and researches at the intersection of political theology, religious ethics, and social change. His first book, Presente, Nonviolent Politics and Resurrection of the Dead, explores the moral and political dimensions of nonviolent struggle. His current research examines the apocalyptic dimensions of talk and action around climate change. Thanks for being here, Kyle.
Great to be with you all. Looking forward to this conversation.
Finally, we have Darrin Sims Jr. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Darrin grew up witnessing how racially divided his city was, and it had an impact on how he saw social justice. He received his bachelor's degree from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and upon graduation, he served as a teacher for Teach for America in Nashville and St. Louis. It was during the Ferguson uprising that Darrin decided to focus on community organizing and abolition. Since then, Darrin has devoted his work to social justice through a theological lens. Darrin currently teaches, preaches, and organizes around faith-based approaches to reducing recidivism and voter suppression. In addition to being a final year student, he also serves as the co-chair for diversity and inclusion on the Candler Coordinating Council. Welcome, Darrin.
What's up?
So for those watching this live, we invite you to submit your questions on the video feed and we'll try to answer them. But to get us started, I'll ask everyone to respond to this first question. What does protesting have to do with our faith, or in particular, your faith? And Darrin, you can start us off.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So personally, for me, like, and I think this is true of Black people, but protesting is a part of us. When I think of protesting, I think immediately back to enslaved people who decided that they would actively rebel for their freedom, or who would sacrifice their bodies so that others may be free. Is that protest is ingrained in like everything that we do. For Black people to exist in this country was an act of protest. For women to have control of their bodies is an act of protest. So protest is like embedded into the American DNA. This country was founded on protests. It was founded on people who wanted better for themselves, wanted like more religious freedom, X, Y, and Z. And since then, we've seen like people in this country continue to protest. I mean, it's so embedded into our fabric that it's even in our Constitution, you know, the right to assemble. So I think about how protesting is not only a part of like us individually, but it's a part of us nationally. And I know personally for me, like I grew up watching like my mama like organize and protest and raise money so people could pay their electrical bills at church. And so like I grew up watching Black women protest in their own ways. And so for me, it's very much something that I was born into. It's very much something that I think we as a country were born into, the act of protest, regardless of what side of the aisle you find yourself on. And that it can look a myriad of ways, you know.
Amen to that, Darrin. For me, this cuts right to the heart of how I understand who I am as a person, and that I don't separate from my faith. So as people, we being created in the image of God, that anything that seeks to threaten, go against, harm the essence of who we are and who God has created us to be, naturally sort of elicits a response of protest and resistance. And so for me, theologically, I see these things directly connected to the very inception of who we are as people created in God's image. And when we have things that are coming against to threaten the well-being of us and who we are, that, you know, naturally a protest to that will arise. And so that's how I, you know, really entered this space, and that it cuts to the heart of the Imago Dei for me and preserving the Imago Dei.
I really appreciate both of those responses. A lot resonates with me and my sensibility. I guess in response to your question, Crystal, I'd say, look, I'm a disciple of Jesus. I try to follow Jesus. I try to conform my life to the example of Jesus. And as I read the Gospels, I find again and again that Jesus was an organizer. He was an activist, a protester. So what are the things that Jesus did? Well, he looked for emergent leaders among the people and called them forth. He cast a vision of new forms of political life. He trained those leaders how to enact that new political life and sent them out to do so, and then brought them back. And they reflected together about how it went. He developed relationships with neighbors, with strangers, with enemies, identified shared interests, planned and executed public actions. Think of the road to Jerusalem, the action in the temple. He held public officials accountable. So, of course, Christians affirm that the Nazarene was much more than an organizer. Jesus is Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God. But as we affirm that Jesus was fully God, fully human, I don't think we should be surprised that Jesus, the Palestinian Jew from the backwaters of the Roman Empire, was an organizer. And as I kind of think about my own faith and my own kind of lodestar as a follower of Jesus, I look to his example as I think about how to bring together or how to follow in his way.
Thank you all for your responses. So I feel like this question naturally comes next then. What is theologically at stake if we don't protest, if we don't move our bodies in this way?
I think what's at stake is people. I think about people like Harriet Tubman. I think about people like Nat Turner. I think about people like Gabriel Prosser, who organized and protested and resisted in a time in which they knew what was at stake. They knew who was at stake. And I think that when we don't protest, when we don't put our bodies and we don't resist the system, people will be left to suffer. And I think that, kind of like what Dr. Kyle was saying, like everything Jesus was doing was for the benefit of the community. So when he was actively organizing and protesting, it wasn't because, oh, like, I think this is just going to benefit me. It was like, nah, because my community needs to be free. And so when we don't activate ourselves and activate our communities, then we risk like the soul of our communities. We risk like the people who like can't stand up for themselves or won't stand up for themselves. And so I think about like, how are we actively like activating ourselves for our kids and for our elders and for like people who can't be on the street, and for people who, you know, at a time during a pandemic where everybody can't, you know, be on the streets. How do we activate for those people? And those people are the people who are at risk. And so like, for me, that makes it very real. Is like, you know, I'm a father, and so I have two children. And so I can't live in a world where my son will be considered a threat, you know, and not galvanize and not work to make sure that he has every possible advantage that he deserves. And so for me, it's about putting people first, putting communities first, and making sure that we like show up for those people.
How do you want to jump onto this question? Oh, sorry, Dr. Gunning Francis.
No, that's great. That was a great comprehensive answer there for that. But just to, you know, kind of keep honing in on this issue of distortion, you know, what's at stake theologically? If we continue to believe that it's okay to dehumanize Black bodies in this way, we are in effect distorting not only our shared humanity, but our understandings of God and who God has created us to be and how God has called us to live in relationship to each other. To permit that to just stand as it is, we distort what we understand to be the teachings of our faith and of many faiths that we know around the world. And so, you know, we engage this work, we understand that it is deeply connected to not only who we are as individuals, but to the life of faith. It has stark implications for congregations and churches and what they are teaching about what it means to follow in the way of Christ and what it means to truly love thy neighbor as thyself and do unto others, all of that. That, you know, if we don't model what that looks like in real time, then how can we say with integrity that those are the tenets by which we live?
I really appreciate, DJ, you're putting this vocationally and relationally, that protest is about who we are, and Dr. Gunning Francis as well, thinking about our integrity as people of faith. And it's about whose we are, who we belong to, who we love. And that for DJ, it's your son, your kids that motivate in a way your interest and engagement in this work. I have two kids as well, and that is a clarifying relationship for me that calls me forth. What kind of world do I want my children to grow up in? What kind of inheritance do I want to give them? And I think that's the right kind of way to think about what's at stake. I mean, I think also what's at stake, well, what's at stake is that these heretical anti-theologies are masquerading as Christianity. You know, the two scholars that come immediately to my mind, Kelly Brown Douglas and her important work on stand your ground culture and the way in which that is embedded within a kind of American exceptionalism that is takes on a theological, not just a veneer, but is deeply theological. It's a heretical theology, but it's a theology that's at work, that's animating white supremacy and the stand your ground culture. And also Willie James Jennings and his work in the Christian imagination, thinking about the ways in which our understanding of Christianity, our understanding of the mission of Christianity is fundamentally diseased. We operate with a diseased social imagination. So what's happening when we protest, when we take our faith into the streets? Well, in one way, in a small way, and not in any way a complete way, but in one way we're restoring, we're offering a therapy to that diseased social imagination, to begin to join together in new ways, to find our vocation and mission as people of faith again, in a new way, a way that resists those heresies that live within our tradition and contests them and calls forth for a different way of being people of faith together.
Dr. Carr, I love that so much. Like, I think about, like, it makes me think of a Chance lyric. Like, I don't know if you know who Chance the Rapper is. I'm in love with Chance the Rapper. And he has this line where he says, like, I speak to God in public. And that was something that just always resonated with me, because it's so like, you know, like when we talk to God or when we pray, it's often like, oh, you know, we're whispering or we're like quietly by ourselves. But protest is like directly the opposite of that. And for me, protesting is a form of like prayer. It's a form of like talking to God in public and saying, like, God, like, this is wrong and I don't agree with this. And it's like talking to like the powers that be and saying, it's like saying, we see you. You know, you can't hide. We're not going to like ignore like what we see. And we're gonna like scream about it in the streets and out loud. And so I think that, like, you know, even James Cone, he writes about like the supernaturalness of freedom and like how like protest and the idea of freedom is innately supernatural. Like I have the right to be free. Like you have the right to be free. Like like that's something, even when everything else around you tells you no, you're not free. Like, I think of Black people, like growing up in the South, like, no, you're not free. Your bodies are not your own. But Black people still saying like, no, like, these are my bodies. These, you know, women saying like, this is mine. I think there's something innately supernatural about that. It's innately divine about how people see themselves. And especially as I've been at these protests and I felt this incredible energy from people, like energy to where people are like talking, like people who like could do serious harm to them. You know, people like, they were people in like full riot gear, batons, mace, sniper rifles, and people at them saying, we see you. Who know, who are just singing and chanting and have drums, you know? So I think there's something divine about that. And like calling, like talking to like power and principality directly. For me, that's divine.
DJ, I love what you said in referencing Chance the Rapper first, but also about protesting not being new. Like, it's a thing that has been a part of our history for a really long time, and just making sure that change can happen and talking directly to power. What would you say is the relationship between faithfulness and effectiveness in these movements?
Ooh, that's good. I think faithfulness is like one understanding like that. So in our current conversation around police abolition, like, we're not going to defund the police tomorrow. We're not going to defund them next week, next month, maybe even next year. But it's about the fact that this conversation about defunding the police has been happening literally since police were founded in this country. Like, we can trace the earliest police department in Boston in like the late 19th century. And immediately people were like, we don't like this. So I think that like police abolition has been a conversation that's been happening. And it's because of those like conversations, policy that failed, policy that gained a little traction here and then kept going. And then we see this, you know, we see Angela Davis, you know, in the 70s and 80s come out and blatantly say, we don't need police, we don't need prisons. A Black woman from the South saying, you know, a part of the Black Panther Party saying we don't need police, we don't need prisons. And now we're here in 2020. So I think that faithfulness is like, you know, the ground has been tilled for a long time to be where we are now, over 100 years. And versus coming up with something quickly and saying, you know, we're seeing stuff now where people saying, oh, you know, we're divesting from police or we're doing police reform really quickly. And we don't know if it's effective. We don't know what it's going to look like. You know, it hasn't been tried and tested. But the fact is that we've constantly, and Black people and Black women who have radical politics, have constantly pushed the narrative forward about policing, about abolition, to where now it's mainstream, to where now globally we're having a conversation about, you know, what does surveillance look like in this country? For me, that's what effectiveness, that's what faithfulness looks like. It means being committed to the movement, not just when it's popular, but even when it's not. And which I think, you know, is why we are where we are today.
Kyle, would you speak to that question in regards to your own research?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, first, let me just, DJ's laying down a lot of wisdom, so I just want to appreciate it. And I think it resonates with my research on social movements, and that if you want to take on big problems, not little problems, but big problems, problems like militarism, problems like white supremacy, and the legacy of genocide and slavery in this country we call America. If you want to take on those big problems, you need a long view. And to cultivate movements can be spaces that can cultivate that long view, in which, and I really appreciate DJ pointing us to the witness, the singular witness of Black women in this regard. I just think of the women who hoped for their children's freedom when they were enslaved. Like, how did they hold on to that hope in the midst of that cruel and inhuman context? How did they hold that hope? How did they work for that hope when it didn't seem like anything that could be done was effective? How do you stay faithful to that hope? Well, that's the kind of like long-term hope that I think movements can cultivate. But you know, this tension between faithfulness and effectiveness has a long history. Max Weber talked about it as the distinction between an ethics of responsibility and ethics of ultimate end. We can think together if we want about how that structures, I think, Christian ethics as a field, as well as peace studies and nonviolence. And those are my academic interests. But I think what's much more interesting is the way they animate activist conversation on the ground. Are we gonna do something? So you'll hear people say, on the one hand, like, this is my stand and I will stick to it and no one's gonna draw me away from it. And there's something prophetic and powerful about that. But then there's other folks who say, you know, insert explicative here, your principles, like, we got to get some things done. And if we're going to get some things done, here's what we have to do. And so they often get, faithfulness and effectiveness often get pitted up against each other. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a mistake. That actually what we want is for a live dialectic of faithfulness and effectiveness, a kind of practical reasoning that includes both of these goods and works through, okay, if we are faithful to this long-term vision that's been incubated in these communities of resistance, if we want to be faithful to that, we need to take some small effective steps now that continue to build our imagination, build the capacity to do something way beyond that. I've learned a lot from folks right here in Atlanta working on prison abolition, and the kind of small piecemeal partial thing that they have done is to take away or to work toward ending cash bail. Now, ending cash bail does not end the prison industrial complex, but it does something really significant and important. It builds our imagination for what abolition could look like. And so a small reformist change like that can be situated in this much longer term vision. And I think keeping faithfulness and effectiveness in a kind of live dialectic allows that to happen.
Dr. Gunning Francis, I think you're muted.
Sorry. I think, you know, Dr. Lambert, with the example of ending cash bail and that being a piece of dismantling the criminal justice system, it's a huge piece. So back to Darrin's point about relationality, like what that means for people in real time to not be imprisoned, where oftentimes they haven't even been found guilty or charged with a crime in a substantive way, and to only be detained because they cannot afford to make bail. You know, that's a huge piece of the puzzle of doing that, for what that means in real time. And yes, that, you know, sort of pitting faithfulness against effectiveness or the other, oh, does this really work? Does it really matter? You know, why don't you try something else? It's the both and all of it. The last thing we want to ever do is to continue to allow the ideological debates to hold up real progress. And so the multiplicity of ways that people are finding to engage these issues, to resist, to work against, to protest, it's the all of that together that's building up to a new way of being for all of us.
Yeah. Dr. Gunning Francis, I'm wondering if you could share more about how this moment is either similar or different to what you wrote about in Ferguson and Faith in 2014. How do those two moments compare for you?
Yeah, so there are many similarities, right? As there were when we look back to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, we can see many similar elements. For example, things like young people being very instrumental in taking to the streets and making the witness public, in saying, no, we're not going to continue to tolerate this. I mean, who would have ever thought that, you know, people would have to send literally young children, as they did in the Children's March in Alabama, that made such a huge difference in moving the civil rights agenda forward. So young people from as young as children on into young adulthood, that we see that continuous thread being held across movements, to include both the Ferguson movement for racial justice and the current movement we see now. We also know that as much as we talked about in Ferguson as this being a moment where people were not going to look away, they could not look away, that what we saw, what happened to Michael Brown, and the images, the pictures that came out after that, that this was really going to be a defining moment. And it was in many ways. Like when you look at the number of international conversations that were not only happening, but continued movement for racial justice related to policing and economics and other things after that happened, we saw that getting some traction. But at the same time, we also saw, after the killing of Michael Brown, the killing of Tamir Rice and of Ezell Ford and Sandra Bland and, you know, so many others. And so as we saw this moment that we thought would really be the kind of watershed where police around the country were saying, look, we got to review these policies, these protocols, these use of force, all of these kinds of things to ensure that, you know, unarmed people are not continuing to be harmed in these ways. But that didn't happen. And so here we are today. And we're seeing young people, we're seeing not so young people, we're seeing people of multiple races step up, stand up and say, enough, we can't keep doing this. One of the things I think is a little different now is in Ferguson, we saw the Quick Trip burn, and that smoke signal got the national media onto the scene. In Minneapolis, when we saw what happened with George Floyd being suffocated to death for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and the subsequent burning that happened, you again saw the media really taking hold of it. One of the slight differences I'm seeing is the way that communities all around this country responded in similar ways signaled to me, and I think to others too, that people all around were saying, this time we cannot look away. With Ferguson, we thought more people were saying, we're not going to look away with this, we're going to deal with this. And many people did, but not enough. Right now, we're seeing even more people say, no, this is a type of injustice that cannot continue to stand. And we've got to make radical, not just little small incremental change, but radical change to bring an end to these type of atrocities. But I still ask the question, number one, why does it require that smoke signals go up in order for people to say, okay, oh, we didn't know it was that bad or whatever? What? People have been talking about this, documenting this for decades. But it's, for some reason still, it's not until buildings start burning that there seems to be sort of more of a widespread response to, okay, maybe this is something we ought to think about doing something about. But the time is now. I just think that the energy that is moving now is relentless, it is determined, it is multifaceted, it is persistent, and it is insistent that this time we will not be scared and pushed aside and permit you to just say, you know, just let this go out with the next news cycle, because we see that the movement is continuing.
Dr. Francis, oh, can I respond? I think that on your point about like buildings burning, I think that's because protest literally comes into conflict with capitalism. Protest directly challenges and prevents capitalism from continuing. People aren't shopping, people aren't, and even now, you know, people are spending their money very differently. You know, we live in a very social entrepreneur side, so where people are intentional about spending money on things that reflect their values. And so protesting, and we saw this in Atlanta, where people were not, you know, where they were always like, oh, they broke the windows at CNN. And people were like, we don't care about CNN. We don't, right? Or Atlantic Mall. And so protesting comes into conflict with one of the oldest structures of America, capitalism. And so then we see a response of, okay, well, there's an economic crisis, so we need to fix this. But why are we putting dollars before bodies? Why does it take a man with his knee on his neck? Why is that not enough? But why, when the police department is burned in Minneapolis, then it's a national issue, or when the Quick Trip was burned, or when the Wendy's is burned, rather than the actual violence that's committed against Black bodies? Why is that not the smoke signal? Why is the smoke signal not the bodies that have been, you know, that have been executed at the hands of state violence? I think that capitalism is a way that it's a signal for the powers that be about we need to do something.
Right. So I just want to, I hope that my statement was clear in the question that I'm raising is, why does it take smoke signals to get a response, right? Because, you know, how many times have we heard, oh, why do people riot? Why do they do this? Well, you know, people like to quote Dr. King all the time. He said a long time ago that riots are the language of the unheard. How many petitions have people filed? How many times have they gone to the city council meetings and tried to talk to people? But it seems to never get a response until the smoke signals get up. And so to your question, I just want to make sure that my point is clear, because I'm asking the same thing. Why are not the bodies enough? Why are not the dead or injured bodies enough? Why does it take the burning of buildings, the cutting to the heart of the economic engine in our country for enough people to say, oh, okay, maybe now we'll do something? So I just wanted to make sure that my point was correct. I wasn't saying that as a criticism of the burnings, but just want to make sure that point is, you know, to your point also, what you're saying, that the bodies ought to be enough. But unfortunately, in this country, the brutality against Black bodies is not enough.
And this is what makes this moment apocalyptic in the sense of unveiling. What it unveils is the way in which, for America, Black lives have always been property. And so comparing the CNN tower to a Black life is heinous, it's morally offensive, and that's how America has valued Black life all along. So it tears back the riot. I've learned from Vicky Osterwell's essay in defense of looting, and she argues, look, looting gets to the heart of the white supremacist system, which is completely bound up with the practice of capitalism and the valuation of life based on its relationship to property. That's why looting works. And it's, we can have another conversation about whether that's an effective and faithful tactic. And that's, I think, an important conversation for movements to have. But clearly it's the case just empirically, as Dr. Gunning Francis is pointing out. That has been what it has taken, the destruction of property, in order to raise the awareness of a wider public about the wrongs that have been committed here.
I mean, and I'm just going to add to that. I mean, I saw something recently, Dr. Kyle, about like the origins of looting in this country. Like, America has been an expert in looting, not only people, but resources. From indigenous folk who were here before us, to Black people, to cultures from around the world. So like that conversation about like looting in America, I think it's an important one to have. I know we can't have it here. I wish we could, but it's like, it's so important. And like what type of like looting is acceptable? It's like acceptable looting in America. Like, oh, you can loot this, but not that. Or these people can loot, and that's okay. It's okay for them, but not for other people. So
what if we took Jesus's action on the temple as our lodestar? What if we said, this is our example for what righteous looting looks like? Turning over tables, throwing out the money changers, taking a whip and casting everyone out, so that it can be a house of prayer for all people, What if we took that as fundamental for what it meant to be a Christian, is to follow in that way? Well, that shines a different kind of light on some of the practices we see, the repertoires of action that we see in the streets today.
So this question came in from Facebook, and it has more to do with someone probably wanting to get involved, but not sure how. So the question is, can you more specifically discuss protesting and the requirement to maintain relationships with imperfect institutions that one is protesting against? So referencing Emory University, the UMC Church. What does protesting mean for students beholden to the academic institution?
Wow, that's deep. I find, for me, protest is about proximity. So the first thing you do is you organize what's around you. Like, it doesn't make sense me going to tell other people to vote and my household isn't registered to vote. And so what I learned early on, my mom always told me, you model what you preach. It's a common saying in the Black church, what we say. And so in thinking about these institutions and thinking about for me, it really does start small. Like, what groups are you a part of? What's your network? What's your social clubs? And it's having those conversations. It's finding out how can I activate not only my own, but what's around me, and where do I need to be pushed? I think that at institutions like these large imperfect institutions, it can be intimidating to say, I think you guys are doing this wrong. But that's exactly why you need to say it. That's exactly why we need to call these institutions out. I mean, I look at Minneapolis, who decided we're going to disband our police department, and the University of Minnesota, who said we're going to divest from police force from our games. That was the direct action of protesters. That was a direct action. That was directly because of people on the small level, because it does not benefit the institution at all. It does not benefit the police department. So literally, students got together and said, this is what we want. And so I think it's about coming up with like, what are we proximate to? You know, at some institutions, sports isn't a thing, but there are other ways to divest from structures of power. There are ways to financially divest. There's ways to socially divest. So it's really just about finding like where you are and what's around you and and what power you hold and wielding that power for people who don't have that power to wield. The rooms that you're in, the people that you talk to, even the things that you post and watch and read, like all of those are ways in which you can divest. And even I learned this from my mentor, and you may know him, Dr. Francis, Reverend Starsky Wilson. What he said, what he told me was, he says, even in my own day as a preacher and as a minister, there are times when people would ask him for a quote, and he would say, "No, I'm going to pass the mic to a younger voice, to somebody who doesn't get the mic." Even though he has a platform, I'm still relinquishing that to lift up this voice that doesn't get to speak, to lift up this woman of color who's at the same meetings I'm at, attending the same marches, doing the same work, but doesn't get a chance to speak. And so talk to her. And so there are ways in which, even on your personal level, that you can like amp up other voices, amp up voices that don't get heard, amp up people and movements that don't get, published. Like really, I've been learning a lot right now about our trans community and the struggles they face. And it's because of people amplifying their voices. You know what I'm saying? So it's really just finding out what you're close to and really what you don't know and digging in.
I'd add to that. Also be willing to ask yourself, what are you willing to risk? Because understanding that anytime you're talking about really going against the status quo of something that you're close to, the institution that you're a part of, there is inevitably risk inherent in that. But what we know, if it were not for the many risks that people have taken throughout history to be able to sort of force the kinds of changes that were needed, we wouldn't even be where we are today, realizing how much further we have to go. So it's just having those real come to Jesus moments with yourself, with your group, with people that you can confer with, and just be real about it and just go in wide-eyed that yes, there are risks involved, but for most people who do engage in this kind of work, we realize that the risk of doing nothing or the risk of keeping things the same is too great, the outcome for that. And so just having those real honest conversations with yourself and just go in as wide-eyed as possible, realizing that risk is inherently an integral part of doing this work, whether you're doing it in the boardroom of an institution or on the streets in Minneapolis or Atlanta or Ferguson, wherever it is, there's risk inherent in that.
I really appreciate the focus here on risk. And I think just to amplify one part of that, that kind of discernment is best done in community with people you love, people who you care for, people who care for you. Like that kind of discernment has to happen together in community. So what are some of the risks that we face now for those of us who want to be engaged in this work? Risks of being beaten or killed by police or vigilantes. That's happened here in Atlanta. Risk of losing your job. Risk of losing relationships, families, and friends. Risk of getting sick. I mean, let's be real, we're in a pandemic. That is a risk. Risks of getting others sick. And so I think maybe coming back to that kind of faithfulness, effectiveness question, we have to engage in a kind of practical reasoning together and discern together with others around us, what kind of risks are we willing to take? And then I think the gift, in my experience, of doing that kind of discernment is when you get on the other side of that, when you've counted the cost, there's a real freedom. Because those people that discerned with you then are going to be able to support you when the risks happen. So that's, I think, a really important, significant part of what movement involvement means So find who your people are, find your affinity group, find your community, and dig in there, whether that's at your work or institution, whether that's at your church, whether that's in the streets, but find somebody's to do that work with.
And can I I'm sorry, Dr. Francis.
Oh, no, that's okay. I just wanted to add another point to that related to congregations and churches, because when we talk about the issue of risk, there are some churches around the country, faith communities that do actively engage themselves in the movement for Black lives in this country, whether it's on the street protesting, whether it's right around the corner from where I live, one of the largest churches in Indianapolis, a predominantly white church, has a huge Black Lives Matter banner hanging outside their church in a very high traffic area. Inevitably, congregations that engage in the movement for Black lives are going to face backlash. I haven't met one who's engaging in the work that hasn't, whether it's that pastor, whether it's the governing board, the leadership, whatever, and they need to be prepared for that. And don't be in this position of, well, we're trying to just, not upset anybody. You can't do that in this fight. You have to decide, are we going to work for the full humanity of all people, for Black lives especially, or are we just going to continue to try to stand on this mythical middle ground, which does not exist? So that risk, in addition to the individual personal risk, as you have already named, we've all already named those, also just thinking institutionally, whether it's a congregation or a school, that does take not only firm stances against racism, white supremacy, but also enacts policies, divestment policies, actions to decolonize the curriculum, whatever it is. You're going to face backlash, and you just need to be prepared for it, but determine that this is the way to faithfully live out our faith and follow in the way of Christ.
And to add to that idea about risk, I think about, I'm a child of history. So I love history, I went to a HBCU. And so HBCUs, intrinsically, you just learn so much history that you just don't. But what really stuck out, I went to Fisk, and Fisk was heavily involved in the civil rights movement. And it was very heavily led by students. So committees like SNCC. So students literally are responsible for dismantling Jim Crow in the South. Students who did the civil rights and who would ride down South and segregated road. It's because of students. So students hold immense institutional power, regardless of what anyone says. The institution runs because of students, and our elders knew that. So in the 60s, when we see students demanding that they be treated equally, that their institution be funded equally, it's because of the power of students, Black students throughout the South, at a time in which it was improper and dangerous to be anything but on your side of town. We live in it. I'm here in Atlanta. My wife went to Spelman. The AUC literally was filled with students who actively organized in Atlanta, who actively pushed legislation forward in this city. And so I'm empowered by students when facing academic institutions. If anything, I feel emboldened to speak up because there are people. I'm able to attend Emory University because people like me decided that I should have the right to. Students decided that Black people should be able to attend this institution, which is named after John Emory, a slave owner. So I think that there's power in students to organize and to protest. I think students should students should be taught that in orientation about ways students have organized at the school. I just think that's powerful.
Yeah.
And so we've kind of talked about a few different ways that people protest, but what would you all say are some practical ways? So what if someone doesn't want to get out in the street? What are some other ways?
Um, the really beautiful moment about 2020, and since 2020 is like the roller coaster that it just won't stop, is that I've seen more organizing this year than I feel like I've ever seen before. In lieu of a pandemic, in lieu of a racist administration, in lieu of just it being unemployment being at an all-time low, I've seen people of all races, colors, faiths, traditions, sexualities organizing actively. Digital organizing has really taken off. Where I've seen people in groups like Facebook and Microsoft that have like adapted and made it available for people to like organize online. I've seen in Atlanta, we have a group called the Atlanta Protest Chaplains that have like organized and are at protests that are praying for people who can't be there. They're getting phone numbers and praying with people when they get back home from demonstrations. There are people who are buying water, who are cash apping protesters. There are lawyers who are, representing people in and out of jail virtually that have been pushing courts. I've seen so many different ways that people can protest. For me, it's about, again, like I said, it's about proximity. So it's about understanding like, what are you around and what can you do? Everybody can't be on the streets because we're in a pandemic. Everybody can't put their livelihood on the line in that way, or their bodies on the line in that way. And we saw that in the civil rights movement, but people who were literally just cooking food to give protests when they got back home. I think about in Selma, Alabama, there was a woman out of a church who was responsible for feeding 16,000 people as they walked from Selma to Montgomery, a Black woman who made over 20,000 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Nobody knows her name. But that's what she did. She found her way to niche. In Ferguson, there was a memorial, in the middle of the street in Ferguson, and cars were running over all the time. And a woman got out there and would direct traffic around the memorial. And so people were finding ways to just organize with what's around them. They weren't, learning. They were activating what was already inside of them. And so I think about thinking about people, what's inside you. Can you design flyers? Because I can't. Are you tech savvy? What's already inside of you, and how do you use that for social good? Like, what's your superpower? Is the way I've heard it. And so just thinking about that and talking to people, like, how can, like, I think like Dr. Kyle said it, like asking people like, what can I do? Like, how can I get involved? Because sometimes it takes a partner saying like, I want to contribute. But I don't know how. So I think, talk to people.
I think in Ferguson, Mama Cat, I think, has fed thousands at this point in Ferguson in the movement, after just as her significant offering, and so many others, to your point, Darrin. Also, get right in where you are. I mean, we can't press that point enough, right? Because too often people just default to inaction because they say, oh, I can't go out in the street, or, I don't really feel comfortable doing X, Y, Z. There are so many different kinds of ways, whether you're talking about political mobilization and organization, still picking up the phone, calling people, getting people engaged, those kinds of things matter. So don't despise, oh, I can't be out in the street, what you can do as something that's inferior or not as important as other things. As I've said many, many times, we have a multifaceted problem in relation to white supremacy, racism in this country. It requires multifaceted solutions and creative engagement from multiple ways and levels if we're going to keep making traction.
Something you made me think of, Dr. Francis, is another quote my big sister has, who's an activist. What she says is that a bullhorn in the street is not the goal, but it's a method. And so the goal is not to be, in the street with a bullhorn and like, yeah, like this is it. Like, no, like that's where it starts. That's not where it stops. And so protests now, I feel the energy is shifting into the political sphere, where people are actively legislating, and it's crazy. This is happening in an election year where people are saying, okay, so now we're protesting at the ballot, so now we're protesting at the poll. And that understanding that it may be around civic engagement. It might be around, whatever, but, don't let the image of what protesting looks like stop you from what your calling is. Another thing I want to say is, and I have to say it, is that watching documentaries and reading is cool and it's good, but that's not where it stops either. So, there's a lot of people saying, read these books and then you'll become anti-racist. I mean, you should definitely read these books, absolutely, and watch these documentaries, absolutely. And then
go and do likewise.
Yeah.
Don't just stop there.
To your family members, what are you proximate to? So watching the film, saying, okay, mom, dad, we need to talk, or X, Y, and Z, we need to have a conversation. And it's really about, for me, it's about those conversations that are happening around you and within your networks and within your institution. Even within the Black church, I'm having a conversation now around abolition, because it's not everybody doesn't agree with the idea of it, but it's about having those conversations with people I'm around.
Right.
That's where it starts for me. And that's why I have to educate myself first, and then I can have those conversations. But I can't just educate myself and then call myself an abolitionist. I have to do the work of abolition as well.
I really appreciate, DJ, you displacing the bullhorn as the kind of ideal or telos, the end of protest. I think the end that we're working for is building power through relationships. So political theorist Hannah Arendt says power comes from our capacity to act in concert. Our capacity to act in concert. And how do you build that power? Well, you build it by identifying shared interests, by building a relationship that then allows you to act, to move in concert. So I think that's really got to be the telos. That's going to be the goal of what we're working for. And all of us can do that. All of us can do that from wherever we are. And it requires some education. It requires some commitments, but it requires organizations. It requires joining organizations, being an active part and participant of being a good citizen in organizations and institutions. It requires building affinity groups that can do the discernment about risk and direct actions if that's necessary, if that's called for. But mostly it requires that we be in relationship with one another, that we invest in relationship with one another, that we seek out and find out what are the interests. Why is DJ out here? Why is he doing this work? Why is Dr. Gunning Francis, why did she go down to the streets in Ferguson? What was motivating her? And then can we find enough commonality to work together, to act in concert, to build power together?
Thanks for that, Kyle. So we are just about at time, but I really wanted to ask this question because we talked about faithfulness and effectiveness, churches being activated, being a community, relying on our relationships and really pushing those relationships to actually make change. But going back to the question of what does protesting have to do with our faith? What about protesting is liturgical?
I think many see it as, a ritualistic act of worship, right? It's one that is given fullest expression, as we've all talked about, our humanity, who we are as community, who we are as people created in the image of God. And the very act, the public act, just as our public other rituals, whether they're worship services, funerals, weddings, whatever, the act of worship is really giving fullest voice to this is how we are giving concrete expression to our beliefs, to our faith, that this is what we believe God desires. You know, so many times we've heard people say, oh, we'll just pray about it, just pray about it. No, this is about praying with our feet and letting people see those feet praying in a very concrete and tangible way that is undeniable and doesn't permit people just to look away and have some image of prayer and worship as something that's either private or relegated to a sanctuary, but rather the kind of public art, if you will, of giving this kind of liberative voice is inherently Christian.
Yeah, I really agree with Dr. Gunning Francis. I mean, as I think about the question, you know, what makes protest liturgical, or how is protesting liturgical in nature? Let me just sketch out a scene. So at an agreed upon time, people come together. They coordinate their movements. They gather together. They raise petitions, prayers, if you will, speech, song. They chant together in a common voice. These participants, they gather around a broken and violated body, a victim of state violence. The culmination of this time is a call to commitment, an invitation to a change of life. After word, song, participants move together in a common procession and then go out into the world, taking with them a sense of vocation and purpose. So what am I describing here? You get the conceit. I could be describing a service of Christian worship. I could also be describing a street protest. Now, there are important differences, to be sure, and maybe we want to talk about that. But at this point, I just want to identify the overlap. Protest is liturgical. Liturgy is political. And we can tie ourselves in knots trying to disentangle them, or we can affirm that for the people of God, just echoing what Dr. Gunning Francis said here, God's work of salvation has something to do with our public life.
Dr. Kyle, I think what you said hit on the nail. Absolutely. Like, I think about in Ferguson, we had a chant where we would say, resist, fight, take those crooked cops to jail. The whole damn system is guilty as hell. And we would say that over and over again. And it was like a song. And then before you knew it, we had 10 songs to learn. It felt like I was at choir rehearsal. We like, there are these protest chants that are symbolic that we even take from the civil rights movement when they would march in Montgomery and march in Selma that we still use today. And so I think I'm thinking of like a historical liturgy of protest worship. But I also think about how I recently was at the protest at the governor's mansion, and I thought there was a moment where all of the white people stood in front of all of the black people and literally put their bodies in front of ours as a form of protest and they did that on their own. I don't know, maybe they sent a mass text out, I don't know. But they put their bodies in front of ours and said, we're going to like stand up for y'all in this way. And I just thought about the way, the symbol that stood for, like the moment that was in at that moment, like what that meant when we could tell that police were actively gearing up to like tear gas people, tear gas folks and stuff. For me, it really just talked about how in church where we just are proximate to one another and can tell what each other's needs. And so I just felt like this high sense. It reminded me of church, like you said. It reminded me of moments of worship, the energy you kind of feel like, they talked about protest and Pentecost, like those moments of high energy, high spirit, to where it physically doesn't make sense, but spiritually there are things going on in the atmosphere and in people, or even people who have came and said, we need to shift this way, or we need to move this way, so being discerning of that out there. And I think that's an important part of protest. You need prophetic voices at these movements. You need prophetic people on the streets working who have always been there. So,
and when we see clergy people show up to these protests with a collar on, with a stole on, or robe, whatever they use to signal that, that gives voice to their prophetic witness. It also serves as, we've seen in Ferguson and many other places where when clergy would step in between police and other protesters with the hope that, you know, you're kind of using their bodies as that shield that you were just talking about, Darrin, because, you know, we know that we've seen, although not all the time, police might be a little less likely to start firing rubber bullets with a person in full clergy guard, although that has still happened. But anyway, yeah, but it's all of that that's needed, and then some.
Well, amen to all of that. And thank you so much, Kyle, DJ, Dr. Gunning Francis, for joining us for our very first Candler in Conversation. For those of you who are watching us live, thank you for listening and tuning in. We'll be back with our next Candler in Conversation on Wednesday, July 8th, to discuss the question of what do I say to my white congregation? And so we're bringing in several white church leaders to talk directly to their congregations and offer advice as well. You can continue to follow our conversations on our Facebook page. You can also check out our website. It's candlerfoundry.emory.edu to see more resources like this one, and to also to continue to engage in conversations like these. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.